Opening hook: the president who gave away America's canal. It was called a betrayal, a surrender, even an act of national humiliation. In the late 1970s, Americans watched in disbelief as their president signed away one of the proudest symbols of U.S. power, the Panama Canal. For generations, the canal had been proof that American engineering and ambition could reshape the planet. It was a ribbon of water that turned oceans into allies and made the United States the gatekeeper of world trade. But Jimmy Carter, standing before the world in 1977, looked at that symbol differently. He saw not a monument to greatness, but a reminder of domination. When he signed the Panama Canal Treaties, Carter wasn't just moving ink across paper. He was undoing 75 years of imperial muscle. To some, he'd given away the crown jewel of American influence. To others, he'd finally done the right thing. And history, it turns out, would prove that he was right. But to understand why Carter's choice was so divisive, why one treaty could ignite such fury, we have to travel back nearly a century, back to when America was still learning what kind of power it wanted to be, because the story of Jimmy Carter's surrender didn't begin in the 1970s. It began the moment the United States first decided to carve a nation in half, to build a passage between two oceans, and in doing so, redefine the map of the modern world. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was stepping into the shoes of an empire. The Spanish-American War had ended in victory. The U.S. now had colonies, global ambitions, and the Navy to enforce them. But power needs pathways, and the two great oceans that guarded America's shores also divided its fleets. A canal through Central America had been a dream for centuries, yet it was the U.S. that turned the dream into concrete and steel. When the French effort collapsed under disease and corruption, Washington stepped in with one bold move that still echoes through history. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt backed a Panamanian independence revolt against Colombia. In return, the new Republic of Panama granted the U.S. a 10-mile wide zone in perpetuity. Within months, American flags rose over the jungle, and construction began on what Roosevelt called the greatest engineering feat in history. Tens of thousands of laborers, West Indians, Panamanians, Americans, dug through mountains, fought malaria, and endured hellish heat. By 1914, the Panama Canal opened to the world. It was a triumph, but not for Panama. Within the canal zone, the stars and stripes flew high, and American schools, housing, and baseball fields flourished. But Panamanians couldn't freely enter the zone built on their own soil. Signs reading "No Panamanians Allowed" appeared. To the outside world, the canal was America's artery. To Panama, it was an open wound. Carter would grow up decades later, far from those jungles. Yet, this story, the story of a proud people fenced out of their own land, would haunt his conscience. By mid-century, resentment in Panama had become a quiet storm. Every generation of Panamanians looked up at the American flag flying over the canal zone and felt smaller in their own country. The Cold War magnified everything. Across the developing world, nations were shaking off colonial chains. Independence was the language of legitimacy. But here was the United States, the self-declared champion of freedom, clinging to a colonial concession in the heart of Latin America. The contradiction was glaring, and the Soviets were happy to point it out. For Latin American leaders, the canal had become the perfect symbol of Yankee arrogance. Tensions boiled over in January 1964, when Panamanian students marched to raise their own flag beside the American one. U.S. guards resisted. Chaos erupted. By nightfall, 21 Panamanians and 4 Americans were dead. Riots engulfed Panama City. The canal zone was a war zone. For the first time, Panama broke diplomatic relations with the United States. The message was clear. The status quo could not survive another generation. Presidents Johnson and Nixon each tried to negotiate, but the idea of giving up any control of the canal was political suicide in Washington. Then came Carter, a Southern farmer, a naval officer, a man obsessed with fairness and faith. And he was about to take on the most entrenched symbol of American power overseas. When Jimmy Carter entered the White House in 1977, America was tired, battered by Vietnam, divided by Watergate and searching for moral purpose. Carter promised a foreign policy based on human rights. Many scoffed. The world was about power, not sermons. But Carter believed moral consistency could restore U.S. credibility, and nothing tested that belief like the Panama Canal. In his first months, Carter met with Panama's leader, General Omar Torrijos, a populist who demanded dignity for his people but avoided Marxist alignment. The two men, a small-town Baptist and a swaggering Latin military strongman, formed an unlikely trust. Torrijos wanted sovereignty. Carter wanted justice without chaos. To Carter, the treaties weren't about weakness. They were about honesty. The Carter administration drafted two linked treaties. The Panama Canal Treaty, guaranteeing full Panamanian control by December 31, 1999, the Neutrality Treaty, ensuring the canal would remain open to all nations under protection of both countries. This wasn't surrender. It was shared stewardship, leading to a peaceful handover. But convincing America of that would prove harder than any negotiation in Panama. When news of the Panama Canal Treaties reached home, Washington exploded. The political right called it a sellout of American sovereignty. Editorials blared, "Carter surrenders America's lifeline." Ordinary citizens mailed the White House thousands of toy keys, symbolizing that Carter had just handed away the keys to the canal. To many Americans, the canal wasn't just a shipping route. It was a monument to national pride, a proof of exceptionalism carved into the earth. The idea that it would soon belong to a small tropical nation struck deep emotional chords of fear, patriotism, and disbelief. Republicans saw political opportunity. Ronald Reagan, then preparing his 1980 presidential run, seized the issue with a fiery line that electrified crowds. "We bought it, we paid for it, we built it, and we intend to keep it." Reagan's campaign rallies featured mock canals and chants of "We won't give it away." Even some Democrats defected, terrified of appearing unpatriotic. Behind the outrage, however, there was a quiet misunderstanding, one Carter knew all too well. The treaties didn't hand over the canal overnight. They laid out a 22-year transition, during which the U.S. would gradually transfer authority while keeping full operational control and defense rights. By the time of full handover, the world and Panama would be very different, but nuance rarely wins elections. Carter faced a storm that could drown his presidency before it began, as protests flared outside the White House and editorials condemned him as a traitor to American pride. Carter knew the real fight wouldn't be in the streets or the newspapers. It would be inside the marble chambers of the United States Senate, where decades of pride, politics and patriotism would collide head-on, and there, every vote would decide not only the fate of a canal, but the moral direction of American power itself. To ratify a treaty, the Constitution required a 2/3 vote in the Senate, 67 senators. Carter had nowhere near that number. The opposition was fierce, emotional, and politically lethal. Some senators brought model ships and American flags to the floor, arguing that Panama was unstable and corrupt. Others claimed the Soviets or Cubans would seize the canal the moment the U.S. left. Senator Strom Thurmond thundered, "If we give up the canal, we give up America's place in the world." Carter countered with facts and moral conviction. He personally met with over 90 senators, one by one, explaining that the treaties didn't abandon the canal. They preserved its neutrality and safety under international law. He brought military leaders, diplomats, and former presidents to testify that the world, and Latin America in particular, would see the move as proof that the U.S. could lead by principle, not just power. His argument was simple but profound. The canal was built for the world, but it sits in Panama. Justice requires that we act accordingly. Carter appealed not to fear, but to fairness. He told senators that true strength comes from confidence, not possession. That to hold onto the canal by force would betray every value America claimed to stand for. Behind closed doors, Vice President Walter Mondale worked tirelessly, offering assurances that U.S. defense interests were fully protected. The Joint Chiefs of Staff supported Carter, a rare alignment between moral policy and military pragmatism. It took months of grueling debate. Carter watched his approval ratings plunge, his political allies waver, and his opponents grow louder. He refused to yield. He knew history's verdict would come long after the applause, or the ridicule, had faded. Then, on April 18, 1978, the Senate voted. 68 in favor, 32 against. By one vote, the Panama Canal Treaties were ratified. Carter didn't cheer. He simply bowed his head and whispered a prayer of thanks. He had staked his presidency on a principle, and won. Yet winning the vote was only half the battle. Treaties, after all, are promises on paper. But history is written by what happens after the signatures fade. Now came the harder test. Could the United States and Panama turn this fragile agreement into trust? Could two nations, once joined by conquest, learn to share the same waterway as equals? After the treaties were ratified, a new kind of war began. One fought not with weapons, but with paperwork, patience, and diplomacy. The Panama Canal Treaties called for a 22-year transition. From 1977 until midnight on December 31, 1999, the United States and Panama would share responsibility for one of the most valuable waterways on Earth. It began with a blueprint. The Panama Canal Commission, a joint U.S.-Panamanian agency, would manage operations. The U.S. would gradually withdraw its troops from the canal zone, once home to tens of thousands of Americans. Panamanian workers would be trained to replace U.S. personnel. The Neutrality Treaty would ensure the canal remained open to all nations, forever. For the first time, Panamanians were not laborers on American soil. They were co-governors of their own destiny. Transition, however, was never simple. The canal zone had been a self-contained slice of Americana: schools, baseball fields, movie theaters, and suburbs built in tropical humidity. To many Zonians, as they called themselves, the transfer felt like exile. They had been raised under the stars and stripes, and now those flags would come down. In Panama City, resentment ran deep. Generations had watched foreigners prosper on land that legally belonged to them. Carter knew this emotional calculus well. He sent cultural advisors, engineers, and negotiators to ensure the process felt like cooperation, not capitulation. There were still protests. Some Americans refusing to leave, some Panamanians demanding faster withdrawal. But the slow rhythm of the treaties kept the peace. Every year, more Panamanian officers trained in navigation, logistics, and security. By the 1990s, the canal workforce had transformed. For the first time, Panamanian captains guided vessels through the locks built by their grandparents' hands. Then came 1989, the invasion of Panama. General Manuel Noriega, once a U.S. ally turned dictator, was overthrown in a brief but bloody operation. Critics used it as proof that Carter's treaties had endangered stability. But in reality, the opposite was true. Despite Noriega's fall, the canal remained secure, operations uninterrupted. The neutrality framework held firm. As the handover date approached, the symbolism became impossible to ignore. December 31, 1999, the dawn of a new millennium. The world would cross into a new century, just as Panama reclaimed the land that had defined its modern identity. At noon, U.S. flags lowered for the final time. Panamanian troops stood at attention as their blue-white-red flag climbed the pole over Balboa Heights. President Mireya Moscoso wept as she saluted it. The crowd below chanted, "El canal es nuestro!" The canal is ours. There were no riots, no chaos. Ships kept moving through the locks. The world kept turning. The U.S. military departed with honor, and for the first time in nearly a century, the isthmus belonged entirely to Panama. In that quiet moment, Jimmy Carter's gamble paid off. History has a way of softening once controversial choices. By the 2010s, even many of Carter's former critics admitted that the canal handover had worked. The dire predictions, Soviet control, economic collapse, sabotage, never came true. Instead, the canal became one of the world's most profitable and efficiently run shipping lanes. The Panama Canal Authority, a nationalized yet technocratic body, modernized every system. They computerized scheduling, increased capacity, and launched a $5 billion expansion that opened in 2016, doubling the canal's throughput. Panama's economy flourished. Its GDP quadrupled between 1999 and 2019, powered largely by trade and logistics. The country became a global financial hub. Small, yes, but stable. And the United States? It gained a trusted partner and unrestricted access to the waterway The treaties even became a diplomatic blueprint for future cooperation, cited by international law scholars as proof that peaceful decolonization was possible in the modern age. Carter's vision had been vindicated, but victory came at a cost. Politically, the canal issue had drained his presidency of momentum. By 1980, his approval ratings had sunk under economic recession and the Iran hostage crisis. Reagan won the White House, partially by resurrecting the Panama Canal as a symbol of Carter's weakness. Carter paid the political price of patience, yet over time, what once looked like weakness began to resemble wisdom. In an era when nations fought to hold territory at any cost, Carter's willingness to let go stood out as moral courage. He believed America's strength wasn't measured by what it could seize, but by what it could relinquish in good conscience. The results proved him right. The canal stayed neutral. Panama stabilized. U.S. credibility in Latin America improved dramatically. Even the military recognized the wisdom. Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the 1980s, later wrote that the handover eliminated a potential flashpoint and strengthened America's moral authority. Still, the handover didn't solve every problem. Panama continued to struggle with corruption and inequality, and many Zonians, displaced and bitter, never forgave the decision. For them, Carter's treaties meant losing not just territory but home. History, however, tends to reward long views. Half a century later, the canal remains a lifeline of global commerce, a living monument not to empire, but to diplomacy. Yet beneath the surface of that calm water lies the memory of every argument, every fear, every act of courage that made it possible. The Panama Canal didn't just reshape geography, it reshaped the conscience of American power. What began as an engineering triumph ended as a moral reckoning, one that still speaks to how nations define greatness. History often celebrates those who seize, who conquer, who take, who hold. But rarely does it honor those who let go. Jimmy Carter's decision to surrender the Panama Canal was, at its core, an act of moral defiance against that instinct, against the reflex that equates dominance with greatness. Carter understood something that few leaders do, that moral authority is the only kind that endures. Empires fade, territories change hands, but a nation's word, once broken or honored, lives forever in memory. The Panama Canal Treaties were not about a strip of land. They were about what kind of power the United States wanted to be. Would it cling to control because it could, or would it uphold its own ideals of liberty and self-determination? For Carter, the answer was clear. He believed that America's greatness came not from its might, but from its example. And in 1977, he risked his presidency to prove it. Half a century later, the lesson still matters. The world is again tilting toward confrontation, nations jockeying for territory, influence, and resources. Each believes control equals safety. Each believes possession equals strength, but history whispers otherwise. Sometimes, real strength means trusting others to stand on their own. Sometimes the bravest act of leadership is restraint. Carter's Panama decision is not remembered because it was easy. It's remembered because it was right, and because it demanded a kind of courage that rarely wins elections, but often defines legacies. He proved that justice can serve strategy, that diplomacy can serve security, and that humility, though mocked in the moment, can outlast pride. He showed that peace isn't the absence of power, it's the choice to wield it responsibly. When the flags changed in 1999 and the ship still sailed, America learned something profound. It didn't need to own the canal to lead the world. The same truth holds today. Power that cannot share cannot sustain. Influence that fears fairness eventually collapses under its own arrogance. As the 21st century tests new frontiers, in oceans, space, cyberspace, the moral question remains: do we lead through control or through example? The Panama Canal is no longer just a waterway. It's a mirror. It reflects what happens when a superpower trusts its own values more than its fears. And maybe that's the challenge for us now, to measure greatness not by what we hold, but by what we're willing to hand back when justice demands it. Because in the end, the true mark of a strong nation is not how fiercely it defends what it owns, but how wisely it decides when to let go.